The evening sun dipped low behind the steel and glass skyline of Grandville, bathing the city in molten gold. A light breeze rustled the autumn leaves along the boulevard as Thomas Bennett guided his black sedan through the thinning traffic. He was exhausted. Another 12-hour shift, another battle against corruption, another day spent navigating the bureaucratic nightmare of the Internal Affairs Division. His title, Chief Investigator of Grandville PD's IE unit, carried weight. But weight alone didn't move mountains. It didn't stop bad cops from walking free. Thomas turned up the volume on his car's stereo. The warm, smooth notes of Miles Davis filled the cabin. For a moment, it was just him, the music, and the quiet hum of the road beneath his tires. Then, flashing red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror. His pulse slowed. Not because he was scared. Because he had seen this before. The sudden blare of a siren made his temples throb. His first instinct was to scan the road signs. Speed limit. Fine. Lane markings. Fine. Lights. Green. There was no reason for a stop. And yet, the police cruiser was on his tail. He flicked on his turn signal and smoothly pulled over to the curb. The cruiser followed, its high beams washing over his car like a spotlight. Thomas exhaled through his nose, adjusting his rearview mirror. A figure emerged from the squad car. Tall. Broad-shouldered. The swagger of a man who thought he was in charge. His boots thudded against the pavement. Officer Mark Reynolds. 30s. Built like a linebacker. Buzz cut. Jaw like a cinder block. Thomas had seen his file before. And he didn't like what he had read. Reynolds approached with the easy arrogance of a man who expected obedience. One hand rested near his duty belt, close enough to his gun to send a message. Thomas rolled down the window before the officer could knock. "License and registration," Reynolds said, his voice flat. No hello. No explanation. Just authority. Thomas moved deliberately, popping open the glove compartment. "Something wrong, officer?" Reynolds took the documents from his hand, scanning them without urgency. "You didn't come to a full stop at that light back there." Thomas let out a small breath. "I stopped." Reynolds tilted his head, studying him. Thomas could see the gears turning in his mind. "You're not afraid of me." "Why? You from around here?" "Moved here recently." "Where from?" Thomas didn't blink. "Chicago." And there it was. The shift. Reynolds' jaw tensed, his fingers twitched ever so slightly near his belt. Then, "Step out of the vehicle." Silence stretched. Thomas didn't move. "Is there a reason, officer?" Reynolds' eyelid twitched. "I told you to step out." Thomas could tell the man wasn't used to being questioned. With a slow breath, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped onto the pavement. "Hands on the hood." Thomas complied. Reynolds began his weapons check. But it wasn't just a check. It was a statement. "I can do whatever I want." His hands were rougher than necessary, pressing too hard, lingering in places they shouldn't. But Thomas didn't flinch. And that, more than anything, set Reynolds on edge. Because this wasn't how the game was supposed to go. He was used to fear. To nervous explanations. But Thomas? Thomas was calm. Too calm. Reynolds finished his search. Nothing. He stepped back, jaw tight. You think you're smart, don't you? Thomas turned, his expression unreadable. I think I follow the law. Reynolds' nostrils flared. You think you're better than me? Thomas met his gaze head-on. This isn't about being better. He took a step closer. It's about respect. A slow silence stretched between them. Reynolds' fingers curled into fists. He had lost control of the situation. He hated that. Get back in your car, Reynolds snapped. And watch yourself next time. Thomas took his papers back, but before stepping inside, he paused. I think you'd want to know who I am. Reynolds let out a dry, humorless chuckle. I don't give a damn. Thomas reached into his coat. Pulled out a leather wallet. Flipped it open. The badge gleamed under the streetlight. Thomas Bennett. Chief Investigator, Grandville Internal Affairs. Reynolds froze. Thomas didn't smile. Didn't gloat. He simply spoke. I oversee officer conduct in this city. His voice was steady. And tonight, I've seen enough. Reynolds' face drained of color. You'll be hearing from me again, Thomas continued. Not as someone you pulled over, but as the man deciding whether you deserve to wear that badge. Then, he slid into his car and drove away, leaving Reynolds standing motionless on the curb. The next morning, Thomas sat at his desk. A thick file lay open before him. Inside, everything on Mark Reynolds. 10 years on the force. 3 promotions. 12 misconduct complaints. 5 cases of excessive force. And yet, not a single disciplinary action. Not one. Thomas' fingers drummed against his desk. This wasn't just a bad cop. This was a protected cop. And he had a good idea who was protecting him. He picked up the phone. Linda, I need every internal report on Reynolds for the last 5 years. And find out who's been shutting down complaints against him. A beat. Then. You think this is bigger than just him? Thomas' jaw tightened. Oh, I know it is. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds was spiraling. He stormed into the office of Deputy Chief Roger Mitchell, his superior. We have a problem, he snapped. Mitchell didn't look up from his desk. I assume you mean Bennett. He's investigating me. Mitchell finally met his eyes. Then we make sure he finds nothing. That evening, Thomas stepped out of his office. Across the street, a black SUV idled. Its doors opened. And out stepped Roger Mitchell. The man smiled. But it wasn't friendly. You should walk away, Bennett. Thomas folded his arms. You first. Thomas stood his ground, watching Deputy Chief Roger Mitchell like a chess player studying his opponent's next move. The black SUV hummed in the quiet street, its tinted windows hiding shadows inside. Mitchell's smirk remained, but his eyes held warning. You don't know what you're getting into, Bennett, he said, adjusting his cufflinks. Some fights aren't worth the trouble. Thomas crossed his arms. That depends on who's losing. Mitchell chuckled, but the amusement never reached his eyes. You're smart. Smart enough to know that some men in this city don't like their business being disturbed. Thomas let the words sit in the air, waiting for Mitchell to say more. But he didn't. Instead, he took a slow step closer. "I'd hate to see someone with your career make the wrong enemies," Mitchell continued, his voice like silk over a blade. Thomas didn't blink. "I'd hate to see someone in your position lose everything because they thought they were untouchable." Mitchell's jaw clenched. Just for a second. A crack in the mask. "Good." He was rattled. "Enjoy your evening, Investigator," Mitchell said, stepping back toward his SUV. "While you still can." Then he slid into the vehicle. The engine roared, and the SUV disappeared into the night. Thomas exhaled. This wasn't just about Reynolds anymore. This was bigger. Much bigger. The next morning, Thomas arrived at his office before sunrise. He needed answers. Fast. He flipped through more reports, scanning every complaint, arrest record, and filed misconduct report tied to Reynolds. A pattern emerged. Every complaint dismissed by Internal Affairs had been signed off by the same person, Deputy Chief Roger Mitchell. Several cases involving excessive force by Reynolds had victims who refused to testify. Multiple arrests linked to missing case files, gaps in surveillance footage, and clerical errors. It was a system. Not just one bad cop, but a network protecting itself. Thomas grabbed his phone. "Linda, I need everything on Mitchell. Personal records, financial statements, anything unusual." Linda hesitated. "That's not an easy request." "You wanted to know how big this was," Thomas said. "Now's the time to find out." A long pause. Then, "You got it." Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds was not doing well. Ever since the traffic stop, he had been watching his back, waiting for Internal Affairs to come knocking. His instincts were screaming at him. He had survived in this job because he knew when trouble was coming. And trouble had a name. Thomas Bennett. Sitting in his patrol car, Reynolds scrolled through his contacts before hesitating on one name. He wasn't supposed to call. Mitchell had made that clear. But something about Bennett felt different. And Reynolds wasn't going to take the fall for this alone. Not when bigger players were involved. He took a breath and dialed. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "What?" "We need to talk," Reynolds said. Silence. Then, "No, we don't." Click. The line went dead. Reynolds' pulse spiked. Mitchell was cutting him loose. Which meant he was expendable. And in this game, expendable men didn't last long. That night, Thomas left his office late. Too late. The streets of Grandville were quiet, the occasional headlights slicing through the darkness. He walked toward his car, keys in hand. Then he felt it. A presence. Somewhere in the shadows. His training kicked in. His movements remained calm, natural. But his hand tightened around his key fob, ready to hit the alarm. Then, a flicker of movement. A figure emerged from between parked cars. Hood up. Hands buried in pockets. Thomas pretended not to see. He stepped toward his car. The figure moved faster. Too fast. Thomas spun just as the man lunged. A flash of silver. A blade. Thomas reacted instinctively. Sidestep. Grip the wrist. Twist. The attacker let out a choked grunt as the knife clattered to the ground. Thomas threw a sharp elbow, connecting with the man's jaw. The figure stumbled back, cursing. Then bolted. Gone. Thomas' breathing was steady, but his mind raced. This wasn't random. This was a warning. And it meant he was getting close. 2 nights later, Mark Reynolds sat in the back of a seedy bar, nursing a whiskey. His foot tapped against the floor, restless. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of drunks and the bored bartender. Then, the door swung open, and Thomas Bennett stepped inside. Reynolds' stomach dropped. He was out of time. Thomas walked over, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down. No badge. No threats. Just a stare. You know why I'm here. Reynolds ran a hand over his face. I should walk out right now. You won't. A heavy silence. Then, Reynolds exhaled, and said the one thing he wasn't supposed to say. Mitchell's dirty. Thomas leaned in. How dirty? Reynolds hesitated. Then, deep enough that if you keep pushing, you won't make it out. Thomas' face didn't change. But inside, he knew. The real fight was just beginning. Thomas spent the next 5 days preparing his move. With the evidence collected by Linda, plus Reynolds' testimony, he had what he needed. Names. Dates. Financial records. Witnesses. Mitchell was more than just a corrupt cop. He was the linchpin of a network that protected officers involved in illegal arrests, excessive force, and even smuggling. And Thomas was about to bring it all down. He made one call. To the press. The morning it all came crashing down, Grandville PD's headquarters was surrounded by news cameras. Deputy Chief Roger Mitchell was escorted out in handcuffs. Mark Reynolds turned himself in, but cut a deal to reduce his sentence in exchange for testifying. And Thomas? He stood outside the department, watching it unfold. One by one, the corrupt officers who had ruled unchecked were being dragged into the light. The system wasn't fixed. Not yet. But today, it was held accountable. At a press conference, Thomas faced the crowd. A microphone. A sea of reporters. And his final words. A badge doesn't make someone a hero. Silence. It makes them accountable.